And now, live from England, bringing you news and analysis that you won't find on the corporate and government mainstream media. It's the WideShut Webcast.
Yes, hello again, resistors. Welcome to the show. I am, of course, your host, Keelan Balderson, and this is Resistance Radio. Check everything out for Resistance Radio at resistradio.com, and my website is wideshut.co.uk. Because your eyes are open, but you do not see. That's the tagline I've used since I started the website. But of course many of you do see, and many of you are not happy about what you're seeing, and lots of people all around the world are starting to see things that they're not normally accustomed to, and are starting to realise that the current system that we live in is well and truly broken. But also at the same time, there's still a large percentage of people with the blinkers on, who are walking around and, you know, they look like they're conscious, their eyes are open, their mouths may be moving. You know, you may call these people mum or dad or mate, but for whatever reason, these people don't want to know some of the things that we discuss here on Resistance Radio. They don't want to know that Libya wasn't really about removing a dictator and saving the people. They don't want to know that Occupy isn't just a bunch of dirty communist hippies without a job. They don't want to know that there's alternatives to the national debt and the cuts. There's still people that are trying to explain all this away within the false political paradigms. You know, oh, it was all Labour's fault, they got us into all this debt. Or now they're saying, oh, it's the Conservatives that with all this austerity we'll vote Labour back in next time. Or there's people that put it all on the immigrants. Oh, Britain's losing its culture. Or we need to save it for the indigenous, whatever. If you still think the big three parties are going to fix things, or if you think that EDL and the BNP are some kind of third party that can fix things, or fourth party, if you still count the Lib Dems as an actual party with their own policies, if you think there's actually a basis to the current financial system, and it's more or less a sound system that we've built the world on. If you still think that in 2011 that war is something humanity needs to be doing, all this warmongering against Iran, all these people still wanting to drop bombs everywhere, then I want to talk to those people. Although I've probably just completely patronised them all. But nonetheless, I don't know where I'm going with this. Welcome to the show. I'm back doing video versions, so if you're catching this on YouTube, I'm now waving at the camera. Hello everybody. My ugly mug back on the camera. Just before we started though, I would have had two kind of camera angles. But I just realised one of the posters that I bought a while ago, it says the show's every Tuesday, and it's not, because the show's now a Monday show. But money's tight right now, so I can't exactly afford to be splashing out on all these overpriced posters and things. Maybe if I was able to lend money out at interest, I'd actually have a bit of money myself, but then I'd be a banker, and I wouldn't be doing this show. But anyway, I'm going to jump right into the first thing I want to get to today, and that's the New World Order quote of the week. This is where I take a news article or political quote or something somebody said where they've mentioned the term New World Order. Because some people still can't accept that the world's powers, which at this time in my eyes is Britain, America and Israel, and the tag-along EU countries, but people still think it's a conspiracy theory that the world powers are pushing us into further globalization and further centralization of control. people still think that's just complete baloney, that this isn't happening. And it's doublethink at its finest. It's just that most people have been told through the media and the fake political paradigms that globalization is just this natural progression of humanity. It's all for world peace and spreading democracy. You know, if we just give these last few Muslim countries democracy, the world will be a utopia. And obviously I'm exaggerating, but generally most people think that more unification in the world is a good thing. But they just don't quite understand who's controlling the world and who's going to be getting all that power when it's fully globalized. But anyway, the New World Order quote of the week, we're going to jump to the New York Times. And this author slightly understands, but in some ways he's supporting the New World Order, and in other ways he's just completely making a joke of it. But I'll paste the link in so you understand what the hell I'm talking about. Conspiracies, Coups and Currencies. This is from the New York Times. The murmurs about Barack Obama being forced out began in Berlin and Beijing. This is some kind of theoretical story this guy is making at the start, so don't think this is actual news. The murmurs about Barack Obama being forced out began in Berlin and Beijing after his party lost the midterm vote. There were hints that a government of technocrats would be imposed on America to save the country from a debt crisis and a world from a depression. As the debt ceiling negotiations stalled out over the summer, a global coalition led by Germany, China and the International Monetary Fund began working behind the scenes to ease Obama out of the White House. The credit downgrade was the final blow. The president had lost the confidence of the world's shadow government, and his administration could no longer survive. Within days, thanks to some unusual constitutional maneuvering, Obama resigned the presidency and Michael Bloomberg was invited to take oath of office. With Beijing issuing veiled threats against our currency, Congress had no choice but to turn the country's finances over to the Senate's bipartisan Gang of Six, which in turn ascended to Chinese and German supervision of their negotiations. Meanwhile, there was a growing consensus in Europe and Asia that only a true global superstate could prevent the debt contagion from spreading. For Americans, the scenario I've just imagined is a paranoid fantasy, the kind of New World Order nightmare that haunts the sleep of black helicopter watchers and Trilateral Commission obsessives. But for the inhabitants of Italy and Greece, who have just watched democratically elected governments toppled by pressure from financiers, European Union bureaucrats and foreign heads of state, it evokes the cold reality of 21st century politics. Democracy may be nice in theory, but in a time of crisis, it's the technocrats who really get to call the shots. National sovereignty is a pretty concept, but the survival of the European common currency comes first. And I'll skip on to the end. He basically says, this is what he says. From the American perspective, a more centralized and undemocratic Europe is clearly preferable to the risk of another recession. For the staggering world economy, it would be disastrous if a burst of nationalism somehow broke up Europe's common currency. Yeah, as if not wanting to be in an unelected EU superstate is some kind of evil nationalist idea, as if there's no middle ground there. You're either a nationalist or pro-EU. Well, it's not that simple. I don't care about the royals. I have no patriotism for the history of Britain and the bloodshed that we've caused all around the world. But I also certainly do not want to be ruled by men in suits who I don't even know their names, sitting in Brussels. You know, there's shades of grey to this, but the media don't really like to delve into that. But anyway, this guy ends his article and says, but that's easy for us to say. It isn't our self-government that's at stake. So, bit of a bizarre article there. Basically, if you believe that there's a shadow government, then you're a paranoid conspiracy theorist who thinks black helicopters are coming after them. But then you can understand why they think there's a shadow government in Europe, because of the Eurozone crisis and all these leaders being knocked down for bankers. So maybe there is a shadow government. But then he's like, well, don't worry, it doesn't exist in America. But then I actually support the fascists in Europe, so there is a shadow government, but I support it, but it's not in America. Now, he's obviously a very conflicted person, but I think the problem that a lot of people run into when trying to analyse the world's power structure is they still see the world as individual countries, as America, as Britain, as Europe. They kind of have these boundaries that we're told exist, but really we've gone beyond that. Sovereignty is completely non-existent in most places of the world right now. Those that control government, or those that work hand in hand with government, it's always hard to kind of pinpoint exactly what's going on. But these groups are transnational. The corporations that have lobbied into positions of power operate on a global basis. I use this example a lot because it's more obvious, but British Petroleum isn't really British. They have more employees in the United States. They've got offices all over the world. They're a transnational corporation. The banking interests essentially have a grip over most of the world. It's a global cartel. The US Federal Reserve is tied to the commercial banks in America, which are then tied to the commercial banks in London, that are tied to the EU and the EU crisis. It's all the same thing. So when he's saying, oh, look at Europe, it's pretty bad over there in Europe, they've lost their democracy, it's almost like there's a conspiracy or something. But then he says, we're still doing okay in America. I mean, has he looked at Occupy Wall Street or the global depression that's been going on for years now? Does he not realise any of that? And the point I'm trying to make is he's failing to realise that the same people that have stolen democracy from countries in Europe are the same people that put Barack Obama in power. The financial cartels, the corporate monopolies. Bilderberg is a Euro-American meeting that happens every year, where the elite of Britain, Europe and the US come to make decisions for the globe. So this shadow government that he kind of acknowledges, it encompasses Europe and America. And let's not forget, WikiLeaks actually came out a while ago and confirmed the plans for a North American Union. So I mean, if you've still got your head in the sand and don't think America is completely controlled by the banks and the corporations, then give it a few years and you may have to contend with a union with Canada and Mexico. Maybe that's the wake-up call that some of these people are going to need to realise that their country is well and truly screwed. But yeah, a bit of a weird article there, half kind of arrogantly mocking conspiracies, half admitting that it's probably going on in Europe, but then failing to realise that what's happening in Europe is just as connected to what's happening in America. These people have got their fingers in the pie all over the place. So a bit weird there. But I mean, the only reason that we're not seeing the same kind of action that Greece is seeing with what's his name, Papandreou, being replaced by a banking EU puppet, the only reason that's not happening in America is because nobody in America on the political stage right now, other than Ron Paul, is against the Federal Reserve or the banks or Wall Street. If Obama wasn't a Wall Street puppet, if Obama said no to the bailouts, if he said no to QE, if he'd backed a full audit of the Federal Reserve, all these things, then Obama would have had a bullet in his head. Or he would have at least been quickly replaced by another puppet like this Herman Cain guy who seems to be waiting in the wings. So what this author needs to realise is that the reason their illusion of democracy is not being taken away is because all the American leaders are already doing what the bankers say. It's just not quite their time for a complete collapse yet. It'll probably come though at some point. It's only so long this system of creating money as debt can go on without the debt completely just swallowing everything. And of course this is all within the author's kind of ignorant paradigm. America doesn't actually have any democracy right now to lose. It's not a free country anymore. I mean, what does he think Occupy Wall Street is doing? That didn't just come out of nowhere. That was born because there's a corrupt financial system. And the American people have a complete inability to affect change in their country because the back door was left open for all the corporate lobbyists to come racing in and to take over. The people angry in America right now are angry for the exact same reasons why people are angry in Europe. Because the bankers got out of control and they're making the people pay for it. And just quickly before we move on to a new topic, next week I'll be talking to Chris Morris, who's an author of the new book Hostile Takeover, the Anglo-American Establishment and the Emerging Global Corporate State, which is a pretty well-defined title for a book. It's exactly where I'm coming from when I talk about these topics. So next week I'll be having Chris Morris on and we'll be getting more deeply into the Euro crisis. Maybe we'll get into how Europe first came about, Bilderberg, things like that, and kind of what's going on now. But stay tuned for that next week. But on a related story, we're going to jump over to The Guardian. Just paste the article in the chat. The Euro will survive and Britain will join, says Michael Heseltine. Britain will join the Euro, Conservative peer Lord Heseltine has claimed. The former Deputy Prime Minister, a long-time supporter of the single currency, said the public had no idea of the political impact its collapse would have on the UK. But he believes Franco-German determination will secure the Euro's future and pave the way for Britain to sign up. Lord Heseltine, who now heads up the government's Regional Growth Fund, told BBC One's political show on Sunday, politics show even, I think we will join the Euro. I think the chances are the Euro will survive because the determination, particularly of the French and the Germans, is to maintain the coherence that they have created in Europe. Now they have got a hell of a problem. Let's be frank about it. But my guess is that they will find a way through. I hope they will, because the downside for the British economy of the Euro going under is catastrophic. People have no idea of the scale of money British banks are owed by the European banks. If the European banks start going, it will be our banks that will be on the line, our government on the line. Okay? You can see how it's spun. Lots of fear. The collapse is going to hurt Britain, so we must do this. But it's problem, reaction, solution. This guy's solution, this Lord Heseltine, his solution is that we must join the Euro. You know, further integration. We shouldn't pull out and save ourselves from the sinking ship. We got to jump straight in there and actually sign up to the Euro currency as well. So let's get theoretical about this. Suppose the end goal is that of a global currency. Well, you can't propose a global currency if Britain is still on the pound. So before the complete collapse of Europe, we'll get Britain onto the euro. So it will be easier to move. You know, when everyone goes to the world currency, if we're already on the euro, it'll make that transition easier, rather than stuffy Britain staying on the pound the whole time. So this guy wants us actually on the euro. It's insane. I mean, if Britain really wanted to protect itself, it would have a referendum. The people would obviously vote, no, we don't want to be in the EU. And we'd pull out of the EU completely. I mean, it would hurt to begin with, but we'd have to restart our manufacturing base, pull out of the euro, and ride the storm. But no, what they want us to do is go head first straight into the storm with everybody else, so we can all get obliterated together, so we're all drowning in the water of Europe, so they can pick up the pieces for pennies on the euro, or pennies on the world currency. I mean, how can anybody propose further integration into Europe to save us from the collapsing eurozone? It doesn't make any sense. They're so deluded, these people. Now, I've got to move on because time flies by. We only have the hour. But another form of control that has emerged out of this system from the UN, some of the think tanks like the Club of Rome, is of course the control of the environment, the green agenda as it's known. And this agenda, essentially, it's hijacked people's emotions. It's hijacked people's guilt about the environment, and it's kind of repackaged it all into this scam of man-made climate change, which in turn calls for taxation and carbon trading schemes. These $1 trillion financial trading schemes that they've created that are basically just a new bubble that's going to burst eventually, that can be manipulated by people with the most money and the most power already. Well, it kind of went over my head these past couple of weeks because I've been focused on other things, and I'm not sure if any other hosts have touched on this, but there's actually been a bit of a backtrack from the global warming alarmists, from the IPCC. They've actually decided to redefine what climate change is, and they're actually conceding that not all climate change is man-made. They're finally admitting it. This idea that's been force-fed to us for the past decade or so, that the evil man is destroying the planet, and any type of weather, whether it's cold weather or warm weather or storms or hurricanes or floods, it's all down to evil man-made CO2. Well, they've actually backtracked on that, and they're now actually admitting that, hang on a minute, there are other natural forms of climate change that also need to be taken into account. And you can see the new definition here. Paste that in. Climate change, a change in the state of the climate that can be identified, e.g. by using statistical tests, by changes in the mean and or variability of its properties, and that persist for an extended period, typically decades or longer. Climate change may be due to natural internal processes or external forcings, or to persistent anthropogenic changes in the composition of the atmosphere or in land use, which would be the man-made side of things. So, I mean, they're finally admitting that climate change can also be caused by natural things, like it always has been, for millions of years since the Earth has existed. Sunspots, solar activity, volcanoes, all these things that affect the climate that they totally ignore. They're finally admitting that just because man exists, it doesn't mean all the natural forces that affect climate suddenly become man's fault. They're finally admitting that that's not the case. And there's a good analogy you can use for this. Were we driving 4x4s during the medieval warm period? Are aliens driving 4x4s on Mars where it's also experiencing climate changes? Of course not. There are so many factors that go into the climate that it's almost silly to say man has an effect. The percentage that man puts out in CO2, and then the percentage of CO2 that actually has an effect on the climate, it's just ridiculous. But they're starting to backtrack. Let me find this other article. So yeah, the IPCC have released a new report on extreme weather, and they're basically saying that science doesn't know whether CO2 has a major effect on extreme weather patterns. So you know how they've always gone on about how we're going to get more tornadoes, more storms, more blah blah blah. Well, now they're actually admitting that we're not actually sure if this has any bearing on extreme weather. Climate change signals are expected to be relatively small compared to natural climate variability over the coming 2 to 3 decades. We don't know whether the climate will be warming or cooling in the next 20 to 30 years because the man-made signal is negligible relative to the natural variability. We only have a low or medium confidence on whether or not frequency of extreme weather events is changing at all, and whether or not greenhouse gases are behind those changes. So they don't even know if extreme weather patterns are actually abnormal, whether they've increased or not. So they certainly don't know whether man's man-made CO2 is playing a role. How could they if they don't even know if the extreme weather's really that extreme or not? And we'll jump over to coverage from the BBC as well on the same topic. When you get down to specifics, the academic consensus is far less certain. There is low confidence that tropical cyclones have become more frequent, limited to medium evidence available to assess whether climatic factors have changed the frequency of floods, and low confidence on a global scale even on whether the frequency has risen or fallen. In terms of attribution of trends to rising greenhouse gases, the uncertainties continue. While it is likely that anthropogenic influences, just making it up now, are behind the changes in cold days and warm days, there is only medium confidence that they are behind changes in extreme rainfall events, and low confidence in attributing any changes in tropical cyclone activity to greenhouse gas emissions or anything else humanity has done. So, all this alarmism that we've been fed for so long, all of these exaggerations that have made the likes of Al Gore the first carbon billionaire, it turns out that they don't even know if some of the extreme weather that we're experiencing is abnormal to begin with, and then they don't even know whether CO2 is playing a role. There's no kind of real world measure to all of this. A lot of it is just computer models anyway. So I don't know if that went over anybody else's heads, but I kind of ignored this for the past couple of weeks, but there does seem to be some backtracking from the global warming movement. And another interesting article from the Daily Mail, if you're wondering why the media for all these years has been pushing climate alarmism, there was a brief insight into that in this Daily Mail article, because journalists, or in this case at least one journalist, has been getting payoffs from the Green Lobby to kind of promote the one-sided view that man is causing all these problems, or supposed problems. BBC's Mr. Climate Change accepted 15,000 in grants from university rocked by global warming scandal. A senior BBC journalist accepted 15,000 in grants from the university at the heart of the ClimateGate scandal, and later went on to cover the story without declaring any interest to viewers. Roger Harrimban, the BBC's environment analyst, used the money from the University of East Anglia's Climate Change Research Centre to fund an ad hoc partnership he ran with a friend. Mr. Harrimban, an influential figure who both broadcasts and advises other BBC journalists, later reported extensively about ClimateGate, the scandal that erupted 2 years ago when emails were leaked from the Climatic Research Unit. So, this senior journalist who influences and briefs other journalists below him, was actually on the payroll of the ClimateGate fraudsters while he was covering ClimateGate. That may explain why the BBC was so certain that these emails didn't show anything, and there was no scandal, and there was still a consensus. Oh, and we're going to do a big documentary exposing everything, and come to the conclusion that, oh, it's man after all that's causing global warming. But yeah, ClimateGate, of course, that was when there was these scientists at East Anglia who wanted to hide the decline, so they could overemphasize the amount of warming that the planet has suffered over the past few decades. You know, the old hockey stick graph where it just goes whoop, but forgets everything that came before it. You know, these were the people that said it was a shame that they couldn't account for the lack of warming, because they so want it to be, you know, they want to fit it into their predetermined notion. But they couldn't account for the lack of warming. It's such a shame, because we really wanted these carbon taxes. They were also the people that were talking about how they were going to subvert the peer review process so only alarmist papers and research would get through. And the funniest thing that I found out of the big climate change emails that were released was that you know how the green agenda, they're always quick to point the finger and say, oh, you're a climate denier, you must be funded by big oil. Well, it was revealed in these emails that these scientists, climate scientists, were actually meeting with the big oil and energy companies on a regular basis. Big oil isn't against the green movement, it's one of the biggest proponents of it. Just pick up any business journal. You'll see BP advertising for sustainable living and green energies and things. The big oil and energy companies are one of the biggest supporters of the green movement now. And you got to understand, what is big oil? What is big energy? Well, it's big profits. The bottom line of any business is big money. And there's big money in the green agenda. So of course big oil is eventually going to jump over to the green agenda, because that's where the money is. It will just become, you know, instead of big oil, it will be big windmill or big electric car. And we've seen this play out here in Britain, where we're being taxed extra on our energy bills, so the big energy companies can fund a move to green energy. Does that sound fair to you? It's the energy companies themselves that are pushing this, because they get to move over to all this new amazing technology for free, and we have to pay for it. They get to move over to the next fad that humanity gets stuck on, and they get to do it for free, and they get to make all the money still. They know that oil eventually is going to run out, so they're just looking to jump into the next thing. But people still have this kind of late 80s, 90s mentality where they think big evil oil is funding against them. No, they're funding you. They're your leaders now. It's crazy. And actually, on a personal note, I see the climate change alarmism on a local level. Where I live, there's a lot of wind farms that have developed in the fields over the last 5 years or so, and there's always big heated debates in the newspapers. But you know, that's one side of it. We have all these windmills now, these wind farms, but also, because I live in the fens, we're basically below sea level. You know, we have all these ditches that drain off the water, and you know, we're not literally underwater, but we're below sea level. And long story short, we experience floods fairly often. You know, historically, it's been known in my area to flood. You know, every 30 years the river will break its banks or whatever. But anyway, earlier this year we got all these leaflets through the post, through our letterboxes, saying, oh, there could be flooding in the future because of global warming and man-made climate change, and how you can go green and all this kind of thing, kind of scaring us into thinking there's going to be these floods. And then the other day we got this really creepy automatic, like a Stephen Hawking kind of recorded message on the phone. It's like, hello, this is the emergency flooding system. You are at risk of floods. It's not gonna flood anytime soon, but this is just a test. It's like our whole town got these scary messages, just saying like there may be floods in the future. This is the new system that will tell you when you're gonna get these floods. But yeah, basically, I mean, where I live, I can see a lot of this alarmism because the fact that we're under sea level and people are like, oh, you're going to be drowning soon or something ridiculous. But we've got to move on because we've only got 20 minutes left. And there's still a lot of other news I wanted to get to. Obviously, the other big news this week is that Gaddafi's son, Saif al-Islam, and the former Libyan intelligence chief have both been arrested. Both were arrested in southern Libya's vast Saharan expanses, officials said. Both had been rumoured to have fled via Libya's porous southern borders to neighbouring Niger or another African nation, but for reasons that remain unclear, neither had apparently left Libya, where they were marked men. Libyan officials said Sunday that Gaddafi and Sanusi, probably said that wrong, would be tried in Libya despite pressure from human rights groups, and other governments that they be turned over to the International Criminal Court, based in the Dutch city of The Hague. So yeah, there's been all these talks about these trials. Will they be fair trials? All this kind of thing. Will the West get involved or not? Should it be in The Hague, or should we leave it to the Libyan people to sort out? But let's call a spade a spade. Of course it's not going to be fair. And it's certainly not ever going to be moral. Now, these guys, Gaddafi's son and his head of intelligence, they may have committed some crimes at some point. They may even be involved in murder. Although the evidence has not yet been presented because we haven't had a court case and no one's presented the evidence yet. But they could well be guilty of something. But if anyone is going to put these people on trial and act like it's some kind of legitimate process, then it certainly can't be the Libyan rebels or anyone connected to NATO. Or any, quote, international criminal court. There would be absolutely no credibility. It's a kangaroo trial. It's so hypocritical. The British government have signed off on the murder of millions of innocent people in the last 20 years or so. So when we try and take the moral high ground and start talking about trials for war crimes, I'm just going to laugh in your face. Because until George Bush and Tony Blair and Dick Cheney and Obama and Clinton and Jack Straw and William Hague and whoever else you want to throw in there, any politician that's been involved in war, unless they're also tried for war crimes, then this has absolutely no legitimacy. It's just a show trial. And the most ridiculous point in all of this is that they're being tried for plotting to murder civilians. Well, thanks to the NATO bombings, 30,000 people in Libya are dead and 50,000 are wounded. Shut the fuck up that this was about protecting civilians. Have you ever heard anything so utterly ridiculous? Not even conspiracy theorists could come up with something as ridiculous as that. that we're going to protect civilians by bombing 30,000 to death, and then we're going to try the people that didn't kill as many as us, but we're going to try them for war crimes. Makes absolutely no sense. None whatsoever. And the predefined kind of media talking points, they've set it up in a very clever way. It's either we try them in the criminal court in The Hague, or we do what's right for democracy and hand them over to a Libyan court. Well, we know why the West wouldn't want to be involved. They're going to go down the path of we'll be nice and let the Libyan people sort this out. And that's how it's going to be spun, that we're doing this for democracy, we're giving the Libyan government legitimacy, and they can sort out their own troubles. But we all know why we wouldn't want to try them, because then all the dirt would come out about the Labour government's connections to Gaddafi, and all sorts of dirt would come out, things like Lockerbie and so on. So they've got it from every angle. And I mean, if you think they're going to get a fair trial if you hand it over to Libya, what, Al-Qaeda? Commanders have come out and said that Al-Qaeda are involved in the rebel government, and that these are people that have killed Western troops. There were Al-Qaeda flags being flown above courthouses. You think there's going to be justice? Libya was a progressive socialist state. Now, I'm not saying I agree with socialism as such, but it was doing very well. Now it's under Sharia law. Ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. I mean, there's no way you can support anything like that unless Tony Blair is right there with them. It's all a big game. And there's an interesting article in The Spectator that relates to Gaddafi's son. Now that Saif Gaddafi has been captured, the race will be on to interview him from a prison cell and ask what his business was with the various figures of the British establishment with whom he was so close. Coffee houses will remember the 2009 party at the Rothschilds' manor in Corfu. Saif, Mandy and Nat Rothschild, a little later Charles Moore revealed in The Spectator. That didn't make much sense. Anyway, he revealed in The Spectator that the trio were later reunited in a shooting party at Lord Rothschild's Wadderson Manor in Buckinghamshire. I spoke to Lord Manderson a few weeks after the piece appeared and thought coffee houses may be interested in the transcript. The noble lord was outraged at Charles' piece because it suggested he was also hanging out with Cherie Blair that night. Yada yada yada. Well, basically it's saying that, Lord Mandelson met with Saif and he was sipping champagne with all these elite, with the Rothschilds in Corfu. Long story short. And it just really is a giant chessboard. One week he's being entertained by the Rothschilds, the next week he's at some show trial in Libya. There's no legitimacy. And I think, unfortunately, we'll probably never know the full truth about what went on. But, I mean, there's a pretty clear picture. And it wasn't about removing an evil dictator, because we'd be doing that all over the world. We only do it when it suits... Well, they only do it when it suits their interest. Got to get away from this we. We're not part of this. Other news to get to tonight before time runs out. We've talked about politics and the economy and climate. But one area that's quietly turning into a dictatorship is food. Money is one thing. You can control people's ability to trade and their ability to buy food if you control the exchange of that trade, i.e. you control money. But Monsanto, and I'm sure you've all heard about Monsanto, They're going a step further and are trying to completely control food and own food. And long story short, basically they've been creating these genetically modified seeds, and through various dodgy business strategies have been forcing these seeds on certain parts of the world so that they get a monopoly over food. You know, because GMO seeds are considered inventions, because they have to go through, you know, a technical process, the seeds can be patented and owned. So the subsequent food and everything is all owned by Monsanto. And obviously we can deduce from that that their goal, their ultimate goal, is complete ownership of the world's food supply. There's lots of documentaries on it. I'm sure you've seen some of them. But in America, there's been cases where these patented seeds, these Monsanto Frankenseeds, have blown from one field into another field that was using normal seeds, and then Monsanto has sued that farmer because a Monsanto crop grew in his field, even though it was just blown over there. And I have no doubt that they probably send people around to just throw seeds in people's fields so they can sue them. But then they tell these people, you've got a choice. You can either join Monsanto and remove all of your normal seeds and just grow our stuff, or we're going to sue you for everything you've got and then buy up your farm anyway. And that's basically the kind of road that Monsanto's been taking. But the news today is they're pushing their seeds in Nepal now. The next country that they're focused on is Nepal, and this comes from the Nepali Times. Hybrid and genetically modified seeds may create more problems than they solve. A US government supported pilot project, well there you see, a US government supported. There's the free market at work, the government working with the corporations. It's called fascism. A US government-supported pilot project to introduce into Nepal hybrid maize seeds produced by multinational Monsanto has set off alarm bells over its potential harm. US aid to Nepal Economic, Agricultural and Trade Activity, NEAT, has got the Department of Agriculture and Monsanto to set up test plots to promote the new seeds in Chitwan, Nawalparisi and the Kava districts. The pilot plan will train 20,000 farmers in hybrid maize production methods and help in marketing the seeds. Organic farmers and activists have a whole list of negative side effects of hybrid seeds: the increased inputs that put farmers in debt and lead to suicides. You know, there's whole reports on Monsanto suicides, farmers just killing themselves in some of these poorer countries. The promotion of unsustainable monoculture. Hybrid seeds demand more and more fertilizer and pesticides with each season to maintain yields. Sterile Terminator seeds smuggled from India, which will not germinate after one use, ruined farmers in that region last year. These seeds are now contaminating local varieties of maize which openly pollinate it. So they have these seeds that only germinate once. So they have to rebuy the seeds from Monsanto every year. What a scam! You know, how is this being allowed? And we go back to the green agenda. Think about it. If our political leaders really cared about sustainability and the environment and our well-being, they'd be promoting everyone and encouraging them to grow their own organic food. It would be something taught in schools. From a young age, children would be taught how to grow vegetable gardens and make their own food. That would be the core of a sustainable society. Tending to the earth and feeding ourselves. But instead, we have control freak corporations and government trying to own food. And they're basically using slaves in these poor countries to cultivate it. So if you want a barometer of how much the government really cares about the people, just look how far Monsanto has been allowed to get. These people don't care about the planet. They don't care about the people on it. They just want to own it all. It's absolutely ridiculous. And the final story before we go tonight, there's something weird with this studio system. It's always like a couple of minutes ahead, so the show's going to end before the time's actually up. But demonstrations are to be banned during the Olympics. Meaning you're not allowed freedom, folks. You're not allowed freedom and democracy when we're having our giant sporting events. So you can only be free when we're not throwing javelins or running races or whatever they do at the Olympics. I'm actually going to be there. Someone had a ticket and offered me it, so I thought I'd go. If anything dodgy goes down, I'll be able to film it anyway. So as long as it's not a nuclear holocaust, that is. Then I probably won't make it out alive, but yeah, whatever. But here's the article. Ministers are planning legal action to restrict public protests during the Olympics amid fears that Britain could be disrupted by lengthy and high-profile demonstrations. The Home Office is so concerned about the impact of the stalemate over the Occupy London encampment that officials have been ordered to produce plans for avoiding a similar conflict during the Games next summer. Ministers' plans, based on the measures put in place to remove long-term protesters from outside Parliament, includes identifying exclusion zones around key locations and fast-tracking the removal of protests that do not have the blessings of the authorities. Just complete tyrannical nonsense. You either have the right to protest or you don't have the right to protest. There's no ifs, there's no buts, there's no like, oh, you can't do it there, you can do it here. You got to be out of the way of anyone that can see it. You know, what is the point of protesting if you can't actually make a point? It's not supposed to be something that's pushed to the side and hidden away in the shadows where nobody can see it. If you think protesting is a nuisance, well, congratulations, it's supposed to be a nuisance. But being a nuisance isn't a crime, it's a part of democracy. It's part of getting other people's voices heard. If you don't want to hear other people's voices, then you're just a fascist scumbag. That's how democracy works. So I'm going to leave you on that note. There's some other stories I didn't get to today, but it's now official that Mark Duggan was not armed when he was shot and murdered by police, as the evidence pointed to at the time. Mark Duggan, obviously the young man that got shot, that caused the Tottenham riots that kind of sparked into the whole London riots and so on. Another article I didn't get to about NatWest. I've sent out letters to people this week telling them that they can now only use NatWest authorised cash machines. And I did a story a little while ago how it was being trialled in Scotland. And basically there's all these little new policies coming out where they're trying to restrict people's ability to take their money out easily. Now it's like, oh, you can't go to that cash point, you got to go to this cash point, blah 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 blah. So that pretty much wraps it up this week, folks. Be sure to come back at 9:30 with the reality check with Blue Bus. But from me, I will catch you next week.
If you found the preceding information valuable, please consider buying a DVD or making a small donation of your choosing. Go to wideshut.co.uk/donate. That's wideshut.co.uk/donate. You are the resistance.